My name is Melanie Novak. I'm a film historian concentrating on the golden age of Hollywood, which I define as the dawn of the sound era to the end of the studio system. So we're talking roughly 1930 through the mid-50s. When I was a kid, my dad worked nights, and my mom and I loved watching black and white films. That's when I fell in love with the movies. In college, I took a film appreciation course, and that's where I learned that film could be studied and analyzed the way literature is. I started giving talks at my local libraries in 2022. I've given 27 lectures over the past 4 years. It's a labor of love.
Tonight we saved the best for last for our True Crime Week, and a mystery, of course. So tonight we have Melanie Novak presenting on Alfred Hitchcock. Everyone give a round of applause.
Thank you, Tisa. Thank you very much. And everybody knows Hitchcock, the man who needs no introduction. So let's just get into it. So Alfred Hitchcock was born in 1899, the same year as Humphrey Bogart, for those keeping track. He was born in Essex, England, so he was an English director. He had one older brother and one younger sister. They lived above his father's grocery store. Now, his father died when he was fairly young, and so Hitch had to drop out. I'm going to call him Hitch. Everybody calls him Hitch. That's what he liked to be called, and that's what we're going to call him tonight. So, Hitch's father died when he was fairly young, and so early on he went to work. He worked as a clerk, and very early on he got involved in the very fledgling English movie business. Now, he often liked to say that he was really where his fear came from and where all of the ideas that his movies came really from two stories. One is probably true, one is probably not, right? The one that's probably not true is that he said when he was about 4 or 5 years old, his father gave him a piece of paper and sent him down to the local police station. And when he got there, the police officer opened up the piece of paper and it said, "Little Alfred's been a bad boy, show him what happens to little boys who are bad." And the police officer locked him in the cell for just a few minutes. And so Hitch always said that this gave him this lifelong fear of the police, the fear of being the wronged man. And while that probably didn't happen, it's a nice sort of metaphor for that is the topic of a lot of his films. Now, he also tells a story, I call it the cold chicken story. He says one night when he was a child, he went to sleep and his parents went out to a party or something and thought, all the kids will be asleep by the time we get home. And Alfred said, young Alfred, not yet Hitch, woke up and his parents weren't there and he was very upset. And so he went down into the kitchen and he opened the refrigerator and he found some cold chicken. And he said, I sat and I cried because my mom and dad were gone and I ate the cold chicken, which prompted a lifelong, what we would call today, struggle with food. So he always associated food with comfort and the police with fear. Now, as I said, he started working in film very early in the silent era, and his first job was actually writing the title card. So if you're watching a silent film, every so often the screen comes up blank and there's a few words written of what the person is saying. He started his career writing those title cards. Now, he was in England, but it was an American film company who had opened up a British studio. So very early on, he saw America as the place that you wanted to get to if you really wanted to make the best films. Now, in 1923, he met Alma Reville, who would become his wife and his lifelong partner, both in the movies and in life. She was a scriptwriter on one of his films, and throughout his career, he ran every decision past her, right? They often say that, Hitch was the creative genius, but that he had 4 hands, 2 of which belonged to Alma. He got his first chance at directing in 1925. He marries Alma Reville, and in 1928 they had their first and only child, a daughter named Patricia, who went by Pat. And as we go through, you will see that Hitchcock often has a fairly perverse sense of humor, and it was very common for him to say that he was celibate his whole life except for one time, the time that Patricia was made, I guess. So the interesting thing about Hitchcock is he had a very long career in Britain before he came to the US, right? He had a 20-year career in Britain, and he made 25 films. So while The Pleasure Garden was his first attempt at directing, he really hit it big with a film called The Lodger in 1927, which was a silent film about Jack the Ripper. And a theme that would happen many times in Hitch's life is that he was often stymied with the ending of his films by the censors of the day. While they didn't have an official censorship system in Britain the way we did in the US, there was the person who was playing the character was a very famous star and actor in Britain, and he didn't want to be seen as the killer and as the villain at the end. So the whole time you're watching the movie, you're thinking this guy is the one who did it. But then when you get to the very end, it actually turns out that he wasn't, and he's just being pursued as the wrong man. And there are a few other times throughout Hitch's career when it would have been nice if he could have made the ending that he wanted. And we'll get into some of those. In 1929, he made his first talking film. It was called Blackmail. It's significant really only because it was his first talkie. In 1934, he made his first attempt at The Man Who Knew Too Much. Several decades later, he would remake his own movie with James Stewart and Doris Day. And in 1935, he made a very successful film called The 39 Steps. It's considered one of the best British films ever made. And the female in that, her name is Madeleine Carroll. And if you hear the term the Hitchcock blondes, Madeleine Carroll is considered the first of the Hitchcock blondes. Hitchcock loved to cast blonde women in his films. Now, some people would say that's because blondes photographed very well in black and white, which they do. Other people feel that Hitch had a bit of a fetish for blonde women. And I think you'll come to the same conclusion that I do, that it's a bit of both. So in 1939, he comes off to America. That's Hitch, Alma, and daughter Pat. And so what's important to remember is that Hitch was not some upstart when he came to the United States to make films. He was 40 years old with 2 decades of filmmaking behind him. He was a master at the top of his field, the highest paid director in England and the most respected. He was considered basically the best director to have ever directed in Britain. But he knew he was the biggest fish in a small pond, and if he really wanted to leave an everlasting mark, he was going to have to come to America. So he came to America willingly. He was thrilled. Now, what he also wanted was to make sure that he got a good and lucrative deal. Hitchcock was always worried about money throughout his career, even when he reached a point where money was really no longer a problem. So all of the studios were courting him. They were trying to give him different deals, and he played them off each other. And he finally made a deal with the independent producer, David Selznick. Now, he signed a 7-year contract with David Selznick, and this would become one of the most fruitful and frustrating partnerships in all of movie history. These are 2 very powerful men who both think that they should be in charge. Now, when Hitch first came over, David Selznick was producing a movie that you probably never heard of called Gone with the Wind. So he was exhausted, he was busy. David Selznick almost killed himself making Gone with the Wind, right? He was a very involved producer, and so when they were deciding what is their first picture together, Hitch kind of thought, he's busy with Gone with the Wind, I'll kind of get free rein here like I did in England. So the first picture that Selznick wanted to make was a movie about the sinking of the Titanic. Now, this picture actually was never made. It was scrapped because Hitch had another idea. He had a novel that he had read, and he knew that it was going to be a winner, and Selznick knew it too. And that novel was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So Selznick was like, sounds good to me, right? So we're going to make Gone with the Wind, and then we're going to make Rebecca. They're both going to be huge money makers. Everything was going well at first. So Hitch started doing what he always did. He cast his leading actors, which were Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. And he read the book and he said, okay, this is a starting point. And he kind of threw the book over his shoulder and kind of made the movie however he wanted, generally following the story, but he didn't see the need to be completely faithful. This was his first major run-in with Selznick, because Selznick felt just the opposite. And Selznick was this big, like, over-the-top, gregarious character. He wrote these big, long memos, and they actually have published a book of his memos. And they're written in, like, you can, like, hear him talking, where he just kind of goes on and on and on. He'd be like, in some ways, like the best boss in the world, because he makes these movies. But he almost kills you, because every day you come into work with, like, a 52-page email of everything he wants you to change. So Selznick read the script thus far and said, I am very disappointed with you, Hitch. We bought Rebecca and we intend to make Rebecca. And so Selznick imposed his will on Hitch in this first film and said that the plot was going to follow the novel. So this was just indicative of the many problems that they were going to have, because while they had great respect for one another and they were both at the top of their craft, they really, at the end of the day, were completely incompatible personalities. For example, as we just talked, Hitch felt that the book was the starting place, a template that you could work off. Selznick liked to say that a film should be a perfect photograph of the book. Now, Hitchcock was very meticulous. He had every detail mapped out in the script before filming started. He actually said that when the filming started was actually his least favorite part of the filming process. He had these detailed scripts, every camera shot, every word, what the actors were going to wear. It was all done and perfect, and then you would go to shoot. Well, the way that Selznick worked on Gone with the Wind and Rebecca and everything else was he would read the script at 3 a.m., throw it out, and write something brand new for the next day's filming. And this is how they went throughout. This drove Hitch insane. Hitch did what he called cutting in the camera, right? He wouldn't take a lot of extra shots. Some directors like to take a whole bunch of film, and then in the editing room they have all sorts of different options. Well, when Hitch realized that Selznick was going to be able to edit the movie any way he wanted, he would just take only the shots that he needed, so there was no extra film to edit. Selznick, of course, wanted options. From a personal standpoint, Hitch had a lifelong fear of poverty. He was always very careful with his money. He never lived a rich, ostentatious life. Selznick would spend wildly, and then he would just gamble to try to get his money back to top off his funds. Hitch ran on his wife almost cooking, an end-of-the-day martini, and a good night's sleep. Selznick ran on amphetamines and barbiturates. Hitch felt he should be ultimately in charge, and Selznick felt that he should ultimately be in charge. So while it was fruitful, it was very filled with friction. But Rebecca was a huge success, right? It was a commercial and a critical smash. And really, it was Selznick who got a lot of the credit because he was seen as being on this huge roll, right? He had just done Gone with the Wind. He had won Best Picture as the producer of Gone with the Wind. Then he follows it up the very next year with Rebecca. Now, what Hitch says, and I think he's right, he would later say to Truffaut, oh, Rebecca, that's not a Hitchcock film. And I think if you showed Rebecca to a lot of people, they would say, yeah, that doesn't seem like Hitchcock's other films, right? But in a way, there is that early Hitch influence in there. I think Rebecca is one of the cases where the two of them together really made magic. But if you had to say, is it Hitch's film or is it Selznick's film? It's Selznick's film. And the Oscars loved Selznick films. Rebecca was nominated for 11 Oscars. That was the most nominations for any film directed by Hitchcock. And it also won Best Picture. And it's the only Hitchcock film to win Best Picture in the Oscars. So Selznick, as the producer, wins back-to-back, 2 in a row Best Pictures. Hitch was nominated for Best Director. He did not win. He lost to John Ford for The Grapes of Wrath, so no shame in losing to John Ford. This was, after all, his first American film. Now, Joan Fontaine and Laurence Olivier were nominated for leading actor and actress. Now, neither one of them won, but I find this stat almost unbelievable. You all know all of the great actors that Hitchcock worked with, and we're going to get into them. These are the only 2 actors that have ever even been nominated for an Oscar in a Hitchcock film. It's sort of unbelievable. Why is that? Who knows? But a lot of people feel that the actors didn't get a lot of credit. Hitch actually was very dismissive of actors. He would say, actors are cattle, actors are stupid children, actors just do what I say. And he was seen as such a technician that I think the actors didn't get the credit for the performances that they deserved. Hitch got the credit for their performances. But it is amazing because he had so many wonderful collaborations. And if I said who was nominated, you would go a long time before you said Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. Now, once we move on from Rebecca, we enter one of these actors who was never nominated for a Hitchcock film, but who really helped elevate. This was one of the great director-actor partnerships in Hollywood history, and that was Cary Grant. Now, Cary Grant came onto the scene because Selznick was completely exhausted after making Gone with the Wind and Rebecca. As I said, making Gone with the Wind nearly killed him. Then he finished it off with Rebecca. So Selznick takes a 4-year break to recover from making these 2 films. And so what he does is, since Hitchcock is signed to him personally, he starts lending Hitchcock out to other studios. Now, on the one hand, this was common practice at the day. Hitchcock liked it. Certainly, Hitchcock didn't want to go 4 years without making another movie, and he was thrilled to not have to work with Selznick again. While they clashed, it was harder for Hitch than it was for Selznick, because Selznick kind of thrived on chaos and conflict, and Hitch didn't. So while they butted heads, it was harder on Hitch. But what Hitch didn't like was that Hitch was being paid a standard fee, let's say $500 a week. I don't remember the fee. Selznick would lend him out to RKO for $2,000 a week, and Selznick would pocket the additional $1,500. Now, this was standard practice. This happened to actors, it happened to actresses, it happened to directors, but Hitch did not like it. Hard to blame them, but he did get to make movies, and because of that, he goes over to RKO and he makes a film, his first film, with Cary Grant. And he makes it with Joan Fontaine as well. And it's a film called Suspicion. Hitch was loaned out for 6 different films, so it was a long time before he and Selznick worked together directly again. So he makes Suspicion. This is another film that is really, the ending was ruined, right, in Hitch's mind. Similar to The Lodger. The story is that Joan Fontaine begins to believe that her husband, who is played by Cary Grant, wants to kill her so that he gets her inheritance money. That he's married her, she's rich, he isn't, that he's married her with the intent to kill her. It's based on a novel. What actually happens in the novel, it's a bit melodramatic, is she's pregnant, she realizes that this is going on, but she loves him so much, she doesn't want to live without him. So he's giving her this poisoned milk. She drinks the poisoned milk, and then she gives him a letter and says, honey, will you put this in the mailbox? Well, in this letter, she has detailed out that he's trying to kill her. So in the novel, and the way Hitch wanted to end it, was Cary Grant sort of whistling in that Cary Grant way and going and putting the letter in the mailbox. So he's killed his wife, but he's going to get caught. But there's a lot of confusion around exactly why that ending didn't happen. Partially it was because of the Breen office, which was the censorship office, but there was a lot of discussion about whether or not Cary Grant should play a villain. Some people say Cary Grant himself didn't want to play a villain. More likely was that RKO didn't want him to play a villain. Back then, the audiences really strongly identified with the characters, and if they saw them as a villain, they would turn against them, right? They didn't necessarily see that they were playing a role. Now, believe it or not, Joan Fontaine is nominated for Best Actress. This is like her worst performance. I'm trying to decide if that's opinion or fact. I think it's fact. But she does win the Best Actress Oscar. A lot of people think that it's as often happens in Oscar, it's sort of a one-year delay, right? That it was really for Rebecca. But the truth be told, I told you before that Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine were the only two ever nominated. And that's true. Joan Fontaine is the only Best Actress to win. And there will be no more leading actor or actress nominations. There were several supporting actor and actress nominations, but it's sort of amazing. Now, anyone who's watched a Hitch film very carefully knows that in just about every Hitchcock film, he makes a cameo. He was doing this way back even in his English films. So there's always a little moment where he shows up just for an instant. And while it was fun, there was also sort of a method to his madness, right? Hitch really felt that the director should be seen as a star the same way that actors and actresses were. At that time, really, people knew, the average public knew who the actors and actresses were, but they didn't necessarily know, like, oh, I want to go see a Hitch picture, right? I want to see a John Ford picture. They just said, I want to go see a Cary Grant picture. I want to see a Joan Crawford picture. So Hitch wanted to make himself a bit of a celebrity. He wanted people to say, I want to see a Hitch picture, because he felt that he brought something special that was different than the actors. So there was a little bit of a method to this madness. Now, this cameo is from Foreign Correspondent with Joel McCrea, which was also nominated for Best Picture. And this one is from Lifeboat. And this is my favorite because these are real, Hitch struggled with his weight his whole life. And around this time, he went on this big diet. He kind of had the yo-yo. And so these are real pictures. This is his before and after weight loss picture. So those are real pictures. And if you can see it, it's advertising a product called Reduso Obesity Slayer. Which of course is a made-up product, but after the movie, the studio was flooded with letters from people saying, where do I get Reduso? So the more things change, the more they stay the same. So this was Hitchcock's second nomination for Best Director. So he loses to Leo McGarry for Going My Way, and Lifeboat was also nominated for Best Picture. Now, he's pulled Cary Grant into the fold. In 1945, he works again with Selznick and one of Selznick's top actresses, Ingrid Bergman, who at this time was at the top of her power. And she made a little, really niche film called Casablanca. So when Ingrid Bergman started working for Hitch, again, she was at the top of the field. She'd already made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. She'd already made Casablanca and For Who the Bell Tolls, and she'd won an Oscar for Gaslight. So these were two people really at the top of their field. And Selznick, again, was ready to produce. So this was another Hitch-Selznick production with, again, very good commercial results. Now, Ingrid Bergman had some very funny stories from the set where she said, like, when Selznick would come down to see how things were going, all of a sudden Hitch would say, oh, you know, the camera's not working, like I don't know what's going on, and they would just basically close down filming until Selznick left because he didn't want interference. And it's funny because Hitch, probably rightfully so, resented Selznick interference, but Selznick couldn't understand it because he actually interfered with Hitch way less than all of his other directors. So he felt that he was practically being hands-off, and yet his version of hands-off is 20 times more involved than any other producer. So they make Spellbound with Ingrid and that's very young Gregory Peck. It's a huge hit. I don't quite think it holds up today. I mean, it was one of the top grossing movies of the entire 1940s. I watched it again before this, and it's funny because Ingrid plays a psychiatrist who falls in love with one of her patients. And Ingrid originally didn't want to do the movie because she said, I think she falls in love too fast. She's a scientist, and she falls in love with this guy in like 5 minutes. And they talked to Hitch and Selznick talked her into it. Selznick had great respect for Ingrid Bergman. So they talk her into it, and it was a huge hit. But I actually think she was correct. So it was the third biggest box office hit of 1945. The number one box office hit of 1945 was The Bells of St. Mary's, which also starred Ingrid Bergman. So her star was rising. Now again, Selznick was involved, so the Oscar nominations come through. It earned 6 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. It did not win, but it was the second most nominations since Rebecca. Now, Hitch is again nominated for Best Director. He loses to Billy Wilder for The Lost Weekend. Now, this was the first of what we will kindly call Hitch's infatuations. Ingrid Bergman was certainly one of Hitchcock's blondes. She got along with him very well, but soon Hitch, as the people on set said, fell completely delusionally in love with Ingrid Bergman, right? And he sort of had this whole fantasy in his head that they were going to run away together. Ingrid Bergman really did nothing to encourage this. She was very kind and very gentle with Hitch. And as she said many years later, it was sometimes not easy for me because I had to keep things light and not allow him to get too serious. Now, Ingrid never publicly had that's the worst thing she has ever said about Hitch, right? And it's pretty mild, right? She liked Hitchcock. They had a very good working relationship. They would go on to make 3 films together. But it was very clear that Hitch's interest in her was inappropriate, right? He had a very perverse and bawdy sense of humor. He liked to talk a lot about things that are really not appropriate. And if the actresses were uncomfortable by the jokes he would make, he would do it even more, right? The easiest way to deal with them was to kind of laugh him off. He did not treat his leading men with the same types of things, right? He was more intimidated by the leading men. He had a very good relationship with Cary Grant because Cary Grant really liked that he just came in and like Hitch was so meticulous and Cary Grant just came in and did what he was told to do. Cary Grant liked that. Hitch liked that as well. And they often said that Hitch sort of idolized Cary Grant. You know, Cary Grant is known as saying, you know, Cary Grant, that's not his real name, right? His real name is Archie. And he has this image that he projects on the screen, right? And Archie would say, everybody wants to be Cary Grant, even me, right? And even Hitchcock did, right? Even Hitchcock sort of, I wouldn't say looked up to Cary Grant, but was sort of in awe of Cary Grant's sex appeal. So Hitch at one point told this story about Ingrid Bergman where he says, you know, Ingrid Bergman came to my house at a dinner party the other night and we went into the bedroom and she locked us in and she just would not leave. She said, I will not leave this bedroom, Hitch, until you make love to me. And a lot of people didn't believe that story. I don't know. Who can say? Who can say? Who can say? So after Spellbound, we get 4 people now who have worked together, 4 legends at the top of their game collaborating. We have Hitchcock, we have Bergman, We have Selznick producing, and we have Cary Grant. And this film is Hitchcock's first masterpiece, in my humble opinion, Notorious. And I've given Notorious a star because this is my favorite Hitchcock film. It's basically got everything that you could want. It's got suspense. It is truly a perfect mix of Hitch and Selznick, right? You look at Rebecca and you say, there's too much Selznick in that movie. This one is perfect. Now, the story of Notorious is essentially Ingrid Bergman is Alicia Huberman, and she's sort of a notorious woman, and Cary Grant is a government agent. Originally, he was an FBI agent, but to get this movie made, the FBI read the script and said, he can't be an FBI agent. So he's just generic secret government. So he's basically pulling her in to catch these Nazis, and they want her, just a layman, not a secret agent herself, to ensnare and sleep with this Nazi, essentially, and figure out what's going on. So it's kind of amazing that they got this through this production censor, but they did a lot of really interesting things. And one of the rules that Hitch was able to get around, sometimes these rules that they had induced creativity, right? And there were very strict rules on how long the kisses could be. The kisses could only be like 4 seconds, right? So Hitchcock was like, I've got these two beautiful actors. They need to kiss for more than 4 seconds. Come on. So what it is, he has this great scene where they start out on the terrace and they're talking. They're actually talking about what to make for dinner. They're talking about cooking a chicken. And so they're sort of kissing, and then they talk, and then they kiss, and then they talk. And it feels sort of like an uninterrupted kiss, but of course it isn't. They walk all the way across the room. Cary Grant even picks up the phone and makes a phone call, and they're sort of kissing while he's on the phone. And so for a long time, they called this Hollywood's longest, sexiest kiss, because it was his way of getting around the censors. Now, these were the types of things Hitch loved, right? He was a technical master. And so what he really enjoyed was, the story, but he liked trying to figure out interesting ways to film it, right? He would say, he came from the silent era, and he would say, I hate movies that are just people talking, right? So he liked to have a lot of visuals, and I think that's part of the reason why his films still stand today, right? If you watch a Hitchcock film, there are sometimes long periods where no one speaks, right? And this film and the camera are telling the story. And this is one of those times. There's a big plot point where Ingrid Bergman basically has to steal this key from her husband, who she married in part of this, and pass it to Cary Grant. And so they're at a party, and you don't quite know if she has the key yet. She's standing there. And there's this big, long scene that starts all the way at the top of the staircase, and it just zooms in all the way to this close-up of her hand holding the key. Now, in today's world, maybe that doesn't seem like a crazy innovation, but at the time, it was thrilling. So Notorious, again, was a huge hit. Now, I called it a Selznick production, and it mostly was. But at the very end, Selznick dropped out because he was filming and he was working on another film called Duel in the Sun. And so at the very end, he actually sold it as a package to RKO for them, and a different producer finished the film. But it was the 8th biggest box office hit of 1946. The number 1 was actually Duel in the Sun, so Selznick made the right choice there. It did get 2 Oscar nominations, including Claude Rains, who plays Ingrid Bergman's husband, as Best Supporting Actor. So at this point, the 7 years are up, right? Hitch and Selznick, their partnership comes to an end. They make one more film together. It was their least successful, called The Paradigm Case, and they decide to go their separate ways. And so at this point, Hitch, as all actors, actresses, directors, producers, and when they reach a certain point, what they want most of all is creative freedom, right? Sometimes for the good, sometimes to their detriment. Now, in this case, Hitch started Transatlantic Pictures, and his freedom was sort of to his detriment. He made 2 experimental films. To his credit, he only made 2. He could have kept going. But he spent too much time working on the camera. So he made a film called Rope, which was actually his first film with Jimmy Stewart, which was not a success. And he made a final film with Ingrid Bergman called Under Capricorn. And in both of these films, what Hitch wanted to do was he wanted to make it seem like the whole movie was one long take, no cuts. Now, the cameras couldn't actually do that, nor could the actors. So he would take these 10-minute takes, and he would splice them together. And it drove the actors nuts, because if anything went wrong over a 10-minute period, they had to start all over. And Ingrid Bergman said, you know, Hitch loved challenging himself with these things, but the audience couldn't care less, right? The audience didn't care. The audience was not impressed by these 10-minute takes. They were bored by the movies. And as Hitch himself even notes, as an experiment, rope may be forgiven, but it was definitely a mistake when I insisted on applying the same technique to Under Capricorn. And Jimmy Stewart actually said, I will never work with this man again. This was the worst experience of my life. This guy is fine, but I am not doing these 10-minute takes. And Ingrid Bergman, later in her life, she won a third Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for a role in Murder on the Orient Express. And it was a very small part, and it was often said that she got it because she gave this monologue. And she says, I cannot believe I got an Oscar for this movie. I didn't deserve it, and this monologue was 50 times easier than the monologue I did in Under Capricorn. Which, truth be told, Ingrid Bergman had always wanted to make Under Capricorn. It was based on a novel, and Selznick had bought it for her. And when Hitch left, Selznick, to his credit, let Hitch take the rights to Under Capricorn so that he could make it with Ingrid Bergman. So Selznick was kind of a work-hard guy, but he didn't hold a grudge. Now, Hitch's plan was basically just to make movies with Ingrid Bergman forever. That was his plan. And so he was truly heartbroken when what he saw it as, he lost Ingrid Bergman to Roberto Rossellini. So what Ingrid Bergman did at the height of her career, she kind of said, I'm kind of bored with Hollywood. I've been watching these Italian films that this guy that nobody had ever heard of at this point, named Roberto Rossellini, is making. And I don't speak Italian, but I probably could learn, and I'm going to write him a letter and see if he'll make movies with me. And he said, yeah. So she went over there. You know what? Ingrid and Roberto is a story for another day. We will come back to that. This is Hitch's story. And as Hitch said about this, because he never made another movie with Ingrid, he said, I am still in mourning. Should I do it in Hitchcock's accent? I am still in mourning for the films I would have made with Ingrid Bergman, the films that never were. When she left for Italy and stayed there, it was a loss to me, to the world, and to her. She didn't see it that way. It might be a loss to the world, right? I don't know. Those films she made with Rossellini they're sort of revered, but normal people are not watching them, and they were not successful in their day. But she did learn to speak Italian. And as Francois Truffaut said, Hitch never forgave Ingrid Bergman having left him for Rossellini. Ingrid and Rossellini, spoiler alert, did end up getting married. And it wasn't so much that Hitch lost her to another man, but to lose her to another director was crushing. Now, I want to give a little epilogue to the Hitch and Ingrid story. Ingrid Bergman being one of the most magnanimous figures in Hollywood history. Many years later, when they said, like, how could you take it when Hitch was telling that story about you, like begging him to make love to you? And Ingrid Bergman said, some people really believed his story. I never got angry when it came back to me. People will believe what they want to believe. Hitch just like anyone else. I loved him, but not his way. Well, I wanted to keep his friendship, and I did. And as you can see, this is them together when they were much older. Ingrid saw him as sort of a paternal figure, not even a paternal figure, but she saw him, I think when he did those things, she pitied him more than was afraid of him. Which is not to say anything about some of the women who reacted differently, right? Ingrid Bergman had equal power, and she was a unique figure. Now, to which you might say, like, what did Alma think about all this, right? Because Alma certainly was aware that these types of things were going on. She was involved in every part of the creative process. And as Elise Randolph said, Alma was his co-writer, his cook. She must have been a good cook. There are lots of quotes about what a good cook Alma is. His housefrau, but theirs was not a grand passion. And to tell the truth, she bossed him. There are also a lot of quotes about how she wore the pants in the family. I told you about how Hitch used to say he was celibate. A lot of people described it as a creative relationship, a brother-sister relationship. Whatever it was, it worked for them. They remained married their entire lives. He was highly dependent on her. If you've seen the movie where Helen Mirren plays Alma, and in that film she has an affair, there's really no evidence that Alma ever had an affair. There was sort of one person, like maybe she sort of got close to, so it's possible, but there's really no conclusive evidence that she ever had an affair. And Hitchcock certainly did not. So after he breaks from Selznick, you know, he kind of goes into the doldrums. He makes these 2 experimental films, but to his credit, he pivots. And in the 1950s, he starts one of the most prolific and high-quality decades that anyone has ever had. The 1950s for Hitchcock were one hell of a decade, and it all started with Strangers on a Train. Now, Strangers on a Train is still very watchable, and actually his daughter Pat has a pretty significant role in it. She had small roles in several of his movies. This was the most significant. She really never had much of an acting career outside of acting in his films, but this movie stars Farley Granger and Robert Walker. They meet on the train, and Bruno, the one character, says, they sort of start talking. One character would like to get rid of his wife, the other character would like to get rid of his father. And so Bruno says, how about I kill your wife and you kill my father, and then no one will ever get it back to us. And the other guy says, we're just like talking, right? Like, we're not really doing this. And Bruno's like, yeah. Well, Bruno goes and murders this guy's wife. So he is not happy. And it sort of spirals from there as he's trying to figure, I can't go to the cops and say, this guy murdered my wife that I really wanted rid of because she wouldn't give me a divorce, but I had nothing to do with it, right? So it's very unbelievable. There's a very good scene at the end where there's this chase where they're on a carousel and it's going around, and it's very much a Hitchcock picture. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Hitchcock blondes, Ingrid Bergman being one, Madeleine Carroll, and there are several others. And that's how people usually talk about them, the Hitchcock blondes with an S. There's even a book called Hitchcock Blonde. But I'm with scholar Michael Wood, who says there is really only one Hitchcock blonde. Who is it? Grace Kelly. So Grace Kelly, unlike Ingrid Bergman, Grace Kelly did not have much of a career to speak of when Hitch discovered her. So this was 5 years after Ingrid Bergman left him for Roberto Rossellini. Now, Grace Kelly was under contract to MGM at the time, and they really had done very little with her. And if you watch a couple of movies that she was in, you can see why. She was in High Noon with Gary Cooper. Very miscast. He's like he's like twice as old as her. He looks 3 times as old as her in the movie, but she plays his wife. And even she said, when I watched High Noon, I was so embarrassed I went back to Philadelphia for more acting lessons. So Grace Kelly came from a wealthy Philadelphia family, and she moved out to Hollywood. And again, thus far, nothing had really happened in her career. But Hitchcock saw her in a movie called Mogambo with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner, and he immediately said, that is the girl I want to make. That is my muse. And as he used to say, I have to consider whether she is the kind of girl I can mold into the heroine of my imagination. And Grace Kelly made a movie called Dial M for Murder, and I call her here his most willing muse, right? He liked to dress her, he had all her costumes picked out, and for her point, she was like, yeah, this is great, he's making me a star. Like, I wasn't doing anything over at MGM, so Grace was quite willing. And they made this movie called Dial M for Murder. The studio, Warner Studio, wanted him to use this like 3D cinemascope. At that time, the studios were just like now, trying to figure out how to compete with television, right? This was sort of the first onslaught of television, and they were trying to answer the question that they are still trying to answer now: how do we get people to get up off the couch, turn off I Love Lucy, and come to the theater? And one of the ways they wanted to do it was to make these 3D movies. Now, Hitch hated it. He was like, this is stupid. It doesn't matter. It's not going to make the movie better, and it's a total fad. And it had this gigantic camera that made the filming very difficult. And in fact, Hitch was correct, because this movie was made based on a play, and the play was still running at the time. And so after they finished the film, per the contract, they had to wait until the live theater play stopped its first run. So the movie was not shown for a year after it was made. And by the time it was shown a year later, this 3D was completely out of fashion, and the vast majority of the people who saw this saw it in 2D. So almost no one actually even saw this in 3D. But one of the most interesting scenes, Grace Kelly plays this woman who's cheating on her husband, and her husband finds out and he hires this guy to kill her. And so the way that he does it is the killer's kind of hiding. He's going to strangle her with this scarf. And the husband calls so that she comes out. It's the middle of the night. She comes out to answer the phone in her nightgown. And the guy comes out and he's strangling her, right? And you can really see here, I mean, he is trying to strangle her and kill her, but it's really Hitchcock's first attempt to put a symbolic rape on the scene. If you watch this, you get the impression that he's raping her. The way that she's over the desk, he's on top of her, but he's trying to strangle her. And so she grabs these scissors out of the back, and if anyone has seen this, when she plunges those scissors into his back, and then he falls over, and the scissors go right up in him, every time I watch it, I have like a physical reaction. So that was Dial M for Murder, and it was very interesting because when they were first doing it, Grace Kelly came out, and the nightgown that she's wearing in this scene is quite famous. It's pretty flimsy for that time, although now we'd be like, it looks like a muumuu. So, but she was wearing this sort of big old style robe, and at one point she says, you know, Hitch, like, this isn't really the kind of robe I would wear to go answer the telephone. And he says, what would you wear? And she said, just like a nightgown. And he said, okay. So, you know, that's one of the most famous, that's what I mean. She was very willing to work with him. Now, Hitch adored Grace Kelly, even more than Ingrid Bergman. He was not in love with Grace Kelly the way that he was with Ingrid Bergman. He thought of Grace Kelly as like a doll, right? A doll that he was playing with in his movies. And I love this picture of him, right? This big, powerful director strikes fear into the heart of all these actors, and he's bringing Grace Kelly a tea in a little china cup. And the famous costume designer Edith Head was actually making the costumes for Grace Kelly. And what Hitch liked to say, and I really think he does deserve credit for the image that we have of Grace Kelly today, where he said he liked to think of her as a piece of Dresden china, right? So delicate, but that she was also a snow-covered volcano, meaning seeming icy on the outside, but passionate and fiery underneath. And in all of Grace Kelly's 3 movies that she made with Hitch, her characters brought an element of humor, right? All 3 of her characters that she plays are quite mischievous. And that is what, when Michael Wood said there's really only one Hitchcock blonde, that's what he felt that Grace Kelly brought to her roles that some of the other women did not. And I think he is correct about that. So Grace Kelly turned down the Eva Marie Saint role in On the Waterfront to make a second film with Hitchcock. And that film was Rear Window. And this is when Hitch also reunites with James Stewart. So now, I said that Notorious was my favorite film, but I think this is Hitch's magnum opus, right? It's this great film. He's got his Dresden china doll in it. He spent an inordinate amount of time on her outfits. Every little piece of hair would dress her up, even though she's really kind of a minor character. But Hitchcock is very much Like, Rear Window is this murder mystery story, but it's also the story of voyeurism, right? If for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, James Stewart is this photographer. He's been injured, he's broken his leg. Now he's just sitting in his apartment in his brownstone in New York, watching all the neighbors through their windows, and then he thinks he sees a murder. But it's really about all of us and how we watch the movies, and it's also about Hitch, how he saw himself as an outsider. Hitch very much saw himself as an outsider. He was very self-conscious about his weight, which he always struggled with. He felt that that was why he couldn't fully connect with people. A lot of people said, he really wasn't, he didn't know how to be a friend, he didn't know how to make a friend, he didn't know how to let people be close. He was always on the outside looking in, and so many of his films have that as their theme, no more so than Rear Window. Thelma Ritter is that right? Thelma Ritter. Yeah, yes. Thelma Ritter. She is excellent. I think one of the best supporting roles in a Hitch film. It was number 8 in the box office. Number 1 that year was White Christmas. Was nominated for only 4 Oscars. Hitch was nominated for Best Director for the 4th time. Do you think he won for Rear Window? One of the best? No. He actually lost to Kazan for On the Waterfront, the film that Grace Kelly turned down. If you're not going to give him the Oscar for Rear Window, come on. I mean, I get it, it's On the Waterfront, but what's the guy got to do to get an Oscar? So now, just like Ingrid, Hitch loses Grace Kelly. Just like Ingrid, he literally wanted to make movies with Grace Kelly and just Grace Kelly for the rest of his life. He made one more with Grace and Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief in 1955. Again, Kelly brings that mischievous quality. And then Kelly gets an even more enticing role than being Hitch's doll, and that is being the Princess of Monaco in 1956. Now, this really upset Hitch, but there's no quotes of him kind of running Grace down the way he did Ingrid Bergman, right? Like, it's a loss to me and the world. He was sort of awed by the fact that she became a princess, right? He was English, he was brokenhearted, but I think he also sort of understood. Now, in addition to making all these movies in the 50s, he also launches his Alfred Hitchcock Presents television show. And this is where he first gets that, this silhouette of him that we see. We've had the cameos, but in many ways, this is the most enduring, most famous image of Hitch. And that was on purpose, right? He actually drew that profile of himself. But he saw the TV show as a way to get into television and also as a way to mine talent for his films. And he was looking for one thing and one thing only, and that was the next Grace Kelly. So, attempt number 1 was Vera Miles. Now, Vera Miles had been acting for 6 years when Hitch signed her, to star in his TV show. Now, once he decided that she could be the next Grace Kelly, he signed her to a 5-year, 3-picture deal. And they made a movie that was fairly successful called The Wrong Man with Henry Fonda. Now, Hitch and Vera Miles got along well enough. She wasn't quite as, she didn't quite fawn over him the way that Grace Kelly did, but no one was ever going to do that again. But he was constantly telling the public, Vera Miles is the girl who is going to replace Grace Kelly. Now, the problem was he had the next film lined up, and she had to drop out of the picture. And Hitch never forgave her, never gave her another good role because she had the audacity to get pregnant. And he would often be like, yeah, she could have been in this movie, but she got pregnant. Very dismissive. So this picture that Vera Miles could have been in had she not gotten pregnant was Vertigo. So she turned down the opportunity to see Vertigo. Now, Vertigo is often considered one of the greatest films ever made. The AFI sees it that way, the British Film Institute. A lot of people, it's usually Vertigo and Citizen Kane are some version of 1 and 2. However, it was not a success when it was released. It was seen as long, boring, and Jimmy Stewart is too old for Kim Novak. And I'm sorry to say, these are accurate. It's a slog. I mean, you've really got to love Hitchcock, in my humble opinion, to get through Vertigo. Now, Hitch did blame James Stewart. It really bothered Hitch. This was a very personal film to Hitch. In a way, it is the story of Hitch and his blondes. You know, Jimmy Stewart is trying to make over Kim Novak. So it's sort of Hitch putting his own personal neuroses on display. So I understand why it's important, but it's a tough watch. So he ends the decade of the 50s with this little film. What's this one? North by Northwest, of course, with Cary Grant. And in many ways, North by Northwest was sort of it was an end of an era both for Hitch and for Hollywood, right? It was sort of the end of this. We were moving into the 60s, this big romantic, love story, adventure story. He's running from the planes, he's climbing down the Mount Rushmore, which I just watched this the other night, and I had never noticed. At the end, they're running from the bad guys. Eva and Carrie are running from the bad guys, and so they're going to climb down Mount Rushmore, right? And she's climbing down Mount Rushmore in her high heels, wearing these little white gloves. Like, take the gloves off. But that was Hollywood. So again, that was the end of that kind of glamorous filmmaking. Hitch would never make another film with the old stars, Cary Grant, James Stewart, Ingrid Bergman. Honestly, they were getting too old, right? Hitch had to figure out a way, how was he going to turn over, right? He was 60 years old. He used to like to say that the James Bond films ripped off North by Northwest, and I think he's got a point. It was number 9 in the box office in 1959. Number 1 was Ben-Hur. So to recap, one hell of a decade so good that we didn't even have time to cover The Man Who Knew Too Much with James Stewart and Doris Day, which is one of my favorite films. But at this point, Stewart's old, Cary Grant's old, Ingrid Bergman's out of the picture, Grace Kelly's off, Hitch is 60. Like, maybe just retire, right? He actually was planning on making a film with Audrey Hepburn, believe it or not. He said maybe his next blonde would be a brunette. But that fell through. There's differing stories. Maybe Audrey didn't like the script. Maybe she got pregnant. It's a little bit unclear. So Hitch said, I don't need any of these stars. I don't need Cary Grant. I don't need James Stewart. Grace Kelly, she's a princess. I certainly don't need Ingrid. I'm the star here. I can make a movie without any stars, and it'll be awesome. And the studio was like, I don't think so. And Hitch said, I'll do it with my own money. I'll have the TV crew make it, and it'll be great. And they were like, as long as you're paying for it, fine. And that movie was Psycho. So he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Now, Psycho, Hitch was 60 years old when he made Psycho. As I said, they didn't want to fund it. He asked the critics not to spoil the plot, and he told the theaters to lock the doors once everybody got in. I don't know how many of them did it, but he had an element of showmanship to him, right? So Psycho was number 2 in the box office. Number 1 that year was Spartacus. It was nominated for he was nominated for Best Director for the 5th time. Surely they gave it to him, right? No. Alfred Hitchcock is kind of like Stephen King, right? They don't get the respect they deserve because they write such entertaining material. So he loses, just to rub salt in it, he loses to Billy Wilder for the 2nd time for The Apartment. Now, Psycho was the most profitable film in Hitch's career by far, primarily because it was so cheap to make. Because the studio wouldn't give him any money and he funded it on himself, it made like 10 times its budget. Now, at this point, Hitch did what I like to call the reverse Taylor Swift. Now, if you're saying, what is the reverse Taylor Swift? I will tell you. For those of you who don't know, from Taylor Swift's recent tour, she took all her money and she bought back the rights to all of her music, right? She bought back the rights to have creative control. So what Hitch did was the reverse Taylor Swift. He sold the rights to his TV show and Psycho, which now Psycho was worth a boatload of money, and he used that money to buy shares in MCA, which owned Universal. So he became the third largest shareholder in Universal. So he basically became his own boss. So they did opposite things for the same reason, which was to buy their creative freedom. Now, Tippi Hedren is the next Grace Kelly. So I don't know that Hitch was consciously thinking of this, but when we think about it, loses Ingrid Bergman, loses Grace Kelly, Vera Miles has the audacity to get pregnant with her husband. And so he wants someone that he can completely mold. So he finds Tippi Hedren. She is a model. She has never acted at all, only in commercials. She's 29, about to turn 30. She's a single mother with a young daughter. She's smart enough to know, I'm a model at 29 and 30. I'm not getting that many more jobs. So when Hitch says, I want to sign you to a 7-year contract, she thinks, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Job security. She's thinking I'll get some bit parts in his television show. So he brings her in, he and Alma, they teach her how to act, they teach her all these things. Not only is he designing her wardrobe for what she's going to wear, he starts having Edith Head design her a wardrobe for when she's just out living her life. So he also decides that from now on there's going to be these little quotes on Tippi, those single quotation marks. That was Hitch. She was a 31-year-old model. She signed a 7-year contract. She had no power, right? Ingrid had her own star power. Grace Kelly had family money. So she was like, I don't need to make these movies. I'll go back to Philadelphia or I'll go marry the prince, right? So what Hitch used to tell the other male actors, he would often refer to Tippi Hedren as the girl. And in fact, there's a film about this that's called The Girl. And he would say to her leading men, when I call cut, don't touch the girl. So everybody realized this was getting kind of creepy, right? This was not just Hitch being Hitch. He was going over the line into obsession. And as Rod Taylor, her leading man, said, Hitch was becoming very domineering and covetous of Tippi. As he became more and more possessive, he wouldn't let me or anyone else ride in the studio cars with her. And so when he made The Birds, so in The Birds, at the end of the film, The Birds is a great film, but at the end, these birds basically start attacking people for unknown reason, and it's never really resolved. So at the very end, Tippi Hedren's character is attacked with birds, and she's being told the whole time, she's sort of rebuffing Hitch's advances, and he's getting upset. And so she has been told the whole time that they're going to use mechanical birds in this scene. But on the day of the filming, they said, mechanical birds aren't working. So she's there, and there are right off screen, there are men, and they're just taking the birds and throwing them at her, right? And so that birds are hitting her, the birds are panicking, and the birds are attacking her for real because they're scared. Again, most experienced actresses would not put up with this type of behavior, but Tippi was really locked in. She couldn't get out of this contract, right? They would sue her for breach of contract. She had no power. So they did this for 2 or 3 days, and then they said, this still isn't really working. The birds are just flying away, right? They would just kind of hit her and bounce off. So they tied the birds, they tied little string to the feet of the birds, and then they tied those strings to her. So they would throw the birds at her, and then the birds would be attached to her. So when they would panic, they would attack her. 6 days they filmed this, until a bird almost pecked her eye out, and she collapsed from exhaustion, and a doctor intervened and said, no more. So enjoy that. Enjoy Tippi's sacrifice when you watch The Birds. So things had turned dark. That's fine. We'll just put Tippi on the sidelines for a while. And Hitch decides, there is no replacement for Grace Kelly. I just need to get Grace Kelly to come back to Hollywood. So he pitches her Marnie. It was announced that she was going to be involved. It's very complicated why she ultimately turned it down. It's a little bit unknown. I think she just ultimately decided, this is too difficult. I can't be a princess and an actress. So she drops out, and Hitch says, okay, Tippi, you're back. So at this point, Hitch's behavior really does cross the line. He starts harassing both Tippi Hedren and Diane Baker on the set of the film. And Hitch eventually makes an explicit proposal to Tippi Hedren and basically says, you're going to have sex with me or I'm going to ruin your career. She says no. And from that day on, he refers to her as the girl, never calls her by name again. And he did, people don't know exactly what happened, right? Is this exaggerated? Is it not? It's pretty well documented by the people on the set that this did happen. But if there is any question, he did take revenge on her, and he did ruin her career. There's a reason that the only films you know of Tippi Hedren are The Birds and maybe Marnie, right? He had her on a 7-year contract. He had several years left. He would not put her in her films, and he also would not loan her out. At that point, she had just been in 2 high-profile films. There was a lot of interest in other studios wanting to borrow her to put her in other films. Hitch would just say, she's unavailable. So she did not make another film for 2 years, right? And so if she had been a really, really great actress, perhaps she would have recovered. But there's no doubt that going out of the public eye for 2 years once you've just made your best film is going to be very detrimental to your career. So after that, eventually Hitch relents and cancels her contract, and she goes on to have a middling career. Now, Francois Truffaut said that after Marnie, Hitch was never the same. He did realize that he had crossed a line with Tippi Hedren, that a lot of the things that he had done with some of the earlier actresses that were sort of funny or just a little bit over the line, this was something very different. But he did continue to make films, right? He turned 70 while he was making Topaz. He was drinking heavily. These films were not super successful by Hitchcock standards, and he was often falling asleep on the set because he was, at this point he's in very ill health, he's drinking. And The Family Plot in 1976 is the last film that Hitchcock makes. He always dreams that he's going to make another. They even had a story and a little bit of a script, but it was pretty clear that Hitchcock's health was going to preclude him from ever making another film. But in 1979, the American Film Institute gave him their Lifetime Achievement Award. He was the 4th director to receive it. There are only 13 directors who have this honor, 50 overall. This was perhaps a way of making up for never giving him the Oscar for Best Director that he deserved. While this was supposed to be celebratory, it actually had a very somber atmosphere because Hitch felt like he was attending his own funeral, right? They're giving me all these accolades because they know that I'm never going to make another movie. And really, he was right because he would be dead within the year. In his speech, he spent most of his speech honoring Alma's contributions, both to his personal life, that she was a good wife, a good mother, a good cook, and a good business partner. Now, Ingrid Bergman served as the master of ceremonies, and she ended the ceremonies by giving him the key from Notorious for Luck. Cary Grant had had it for a long time. He gave it to Ingrid. She gave it to Alfred Hitchcock. Unfortunately, that key did not bring him much luck because he was dead a few years later, specifically from kidney failure, but he had a lot of poor health. He was survived, of course, by Alma, who died 2 years later, and their daughter, Pat. And while the end of Hitchcock's life, the Tippi Hedren interlude is without question a dark stain on Hitchcock's career, in my mind, it doesn't take away from the enjoyment from all these films, right? It's history, it's what happened, it's not acceptable, but it's a question of, can we separate the art from the artists? And even Tippi Hedren herself has said she wants people to see the birds. She writes a very interesting memoir about it. She doesn't excuse Hitch. She talks about how, like, he made me and destroyed me. She ultimately says that she decided not to let that interlude ruin her life, and decades later she did attend his funeral as a way of sort of closing that chapter of her life. He had a 6-decade career. His film earned 46 Oscar nominations, only 6 wins, none of them, of course, for our dear Hitchcock himself, despite 5 Best Director nominations. And what a career it is, and all I say to you now is, good evening. Thank you. Okay. Everybody always asks me, what should I read and what should I watch? And I usually put like this whole list, and then people say, I couldn't remember. So do yourself a favor, don't watch Vertigo, watch Notorious, and if you want to read about all the blondes, there's the book for you. Thank you all for coming tonight.